Hello friends and welcome back to the channel. Today we'll talk about a question that I've been asked a couple of times on my autolysation video. It is about adding salt and yeast to your autolyse. An autolyse is just flour and water mixed and left to hydrate. And this is not how you add salt and yeast. Right, jokes aside, I'll show you two different methods, and both of them work just as well in my opinion. And you can choose whichever is more convenient for you. If you don't know what autolysation is, would like to learn more about it, click the link in top right corner. I have a video for that. But for those who do know, what I suggest doing is not using all of your water. Keep maybe 2 tablespoons. This will be used for dissolving the yeast in. And now to autolyse our flour. Just use most of the water, add all of the flour, give it a good old mix until you don't see any more dry floury bits. We'll cover it up and we'll leave it to rest and hydrate. This may take from 20 minutes up to a few hours. Depends on what kind of bread you're making. This though, I left for 1 hour. And now, we can add our salt and yeast. As you can see, from a shaggy mass, it's become nice and stretchy and glutinous. And the first thing to do is to hydrate the yeast. Obviously, if you put dry yeast on your dough, it'll be quite difficult to work it in. And just a couple of tablespoons of water do the job. Now mix it all up and pour it over your dough. Simple as that. Maybe don't use a tall container like I did. It's quite difficult to get all the yeast out. Now to continue, wet your hand and squeeze the yeast water in. And once everything's come together, start kneading the dough. The autolysation method is normally used for high hydration doughs. This dough has a hydration level of 75%, and I have a video explaining dough hydration bakers percentages. You'll find it in the link in the top right corner. Because this is a high hydration dough, I'm using a stretch and fold method to knead it. And to learn more about hand kneading dough, click the link in the top right corner. But the main point here is to develop the gluten a little bit before adding the salt. So I use the stretch and fold method to knead the dough for around 3 minutes. Now I stretched it out and sprinkle over the salt in a nice even layer. Next up, wet your hands with some water and dimple the salt in. Rub it in, squeeze it in, do whatever you have to do. There's no right or wrong here. Give it a slap, then get your scraper, collect the dough up into a ball again, and keep kneading. And from here on in, you want to continue kneading your dough until you've fully developed gluten and you're happy with it. Now this is easy enough with table salt. It's quite fine, right? It will melt in just a couple of minutes. If you only have flaky sea salt, I would suggest grinding it down. Otherwise it might not dissolve. But this dough is ready, and that was the first method. So let's see the next method. Once again, we're starting off with flour, water, yeast and salt. And just as before, we're going to pour most of the water in a bowl and just leave a couple of tablespoons for hydrating the yeast. Now add the flour and give it all a good mix. The reason we're not adding salt to the autolyse, which would be quite convenient, is because it would compete for the water with the flour, and your dough would come out quite stiff. So the next step here is to sprinkle the salt over the top of the dough. And no, I'm not contradicting what I just said. The salt here will only affect the top layer of the dough, which is not a big deal. And if you wet your hand and just press it in slightly, that'll do the trick. And you can use this method, it's more convenient. It doesn't really make a big difference in the end dough. What it does do is ensure that you definitely added the salt. And whilst the dough is in the autolysation process, for however long it may be, the salt will have completely dissolved and we won't have to stop halfway through the kneading process to work it into the dough. So it's been 1 hour, our dough looks good, it's nice and stretchy. Now I would suggest giving it a couple of folds just to seal in the salt, because you don't want your salt and your yeast to mingle for too long. And now we'll do the same as before. We'll add the water to the yeast, give it all a good mix, and then add it into the dough. And now we can start the kneading process. And that's your second method of adding yeast and salt to an autolyse. What I would like to add is that, let's say for example, you're making a dough that uses a pre-ferment as well as autolysing the rest of the dough. Then what you can do is just dump all your salt and your yeast in the pre-ferment and hydrate it in there. Just give it all a good mix, then add it to your autolyse and keep kneading. And that is an even more convenient way of doing it. but it all depends on what kind of dough you're making. But as always, if you have any questions or suggestions, drop them down in comments, subscribe for more videos, and check out my playlists on principles of baking, on the steps of baking, and I also have loads of recipes on my channel. I'm your one-stop bread baking shop. Thank you so much for watching, see you in the next one.